Christmas Eve was supposed to be the night Amara Whitlock finally felt safe again. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts, the tree in the corner glowed with warm amber light, and for the first time in months, she had allowed herself to believe that the tension in her marriage was simply the ordinary weariness of two busy adults trying to hold a life together. She had spent the afternoon setting the table with the good china, the plates her grandmother had left her, arranging them with the kind of care that only a woman still hoping still gives. Sterling Vaughn came home a little after 7, his coat still smelling of the cold outside, and he did not take it off before he set a thin folder beside her wine glass. She thought at first it might be a gift, something wrapped in the dry language of a man who had never been good at romance but tried anyway in strange, practical ways. Instead, she opened it and found her own name typed beside his on a petition for dissolution of marriage, the ink so fresh it seemed to still be drying under the candlelight. He told her without ceremony that the marriage no longer meant anything to him, that he had thought it over for a long time, and there was no point pretending otherwise any longer. Amara did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply set down her fork, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him the way she might look at a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house, and that stillness unsettled Sterling more than tears ever could have. He had rehearsed this moment for weeks, imagining her breaking down, imagining himself comforting her with practiced patience before delivering the final blow, and her calm took the script out of his hands entirely. He filled the silence, the way men like him always do, with logistics. He said he had already spoken to an attorney, that the paperwork was straightforward, that if she signed quickly, they could both move on without dragging things through court, like people who enjoyed making each other suffer. Amara studied his face, the face she had watched grow lines of laughter and worry over 11 years, and asked him quietly why he had chosen tonight of all nights, why Christmas Eve, why the one evening a year she had always treated as sacred ground in their home. Sterling looked away, toward the window, toward the string of lights blinking on the house across the street, and said only that timing did not matter, that a decision was a decision regardless of the calendar. But Amara had spent enough years reading contracts for a living, had spent enough years noticing what people did not say, to understand that a man does not choose Christmas Eve by accident. A man chooses Christmas Eve because he believes a woman will be too stunned, too eager to preserve the holiday for whatever family still gathered around her, to fight back with her full strength. She began turning the pages of the folder slowly, deliberately, and near the back, she found a document that made her breath catch, a financial disclosure form dated weeks earlier, long before Sterling had ever hinted that anything between them was wrong. The date sat there in plain black print, undeniable, proof that whatever conversation he believed he was having with her tonight, he had begun writing its ending long before he let her see the first page. She did not confront him with it immediately. She closed the folder gently, as though it were something fragile, and told him she would need time to review everything with an attorney of her own before she signed a single line. Sterling seemed almost amused by this, the kind of tired amusement a man wears when he believes the outcome is already settled, and he told her that time would not change anything, that the numbers were the numbers, and the decision was final. Amara rose from the table, carried her plate to the sink, though she had not eaten a bite, and stood there a long moment with her back to him, staring at her own reflection ghosted faintly in the dark window glass. In that reflection, she could see the outline of the tree behind her, the lights blinking steadily, indifferent to the fact that somewhere behind that glow her marriage had just been declared over by a man who had apparently been planning its funeral for weeks while still sleeping beside her every night. She thought of every dinner they had shared in the months before, every conversation about weekend plans and family visits, every small, ordinary kindness he had performed while, according to the paper in that folder, he had already been meeting with lawyers to plan how to leave her with as little as possible. The betrayal was not only in the ending of the marriage, it was in every day he had spent pretending it was still whole. In the days that followed, Amara did what she had always done when the world tried to knock her off balance. She organized. She pulled every financial statement she could find, every bank record, every investment summary that had crossed her desk over the years of their marriage, and she began laying them out across the dining table like pieces of a puzzle whose final picture she did not yet understand. Sterling, for his part, seemed to expect this and did not object, perhaps because he believed the paperwork already favored him, perhaps because he underestimated how carefully she would read it. He presented her with a proposed settlement agreement that divided their assets in a manner so lopsided it bordered on insulting, framing it not as a negotiation but as a formality, something she could sign in an afternoon, so they could both, in his words, stop wasting each other's time. He told her the largest joint account had already been restructured for tax purposes, that certain investments had been moved into accounts under his name alone for reasons he described only as administrative, and that none of this should concern her because the house, at least, would remain hers to keep. Amara listened to every word with the composed attention of a woman taking notes at a meeting rather than a wife hearing her marriage dismantled piece by piece, and she asked no questions that might reveal how closely she was paying attention. In the evenings, after Sterling retreated to his study with the door half closed, the way he always did when he wanted to be left alone, Amara sat at the kitchen table under a single lamp and read through years of statements she had once glanced at only briefly, trusting that the man who managed most of their finances was managing them honestly. She began to notice how much of that trust had been built on convenience rather than proof, how easily she had allowed herself to sign whatever he placed in front of her, because signing felt like an act of partnership rather than an act of exposure. Now every signature felt different in her hands, heavier, and she found herself reading each line twice before she understood what it actually meant. She began quietly making copies of everything, scanning documents late at night after Sterling had gone to sleep, saving digital files to a drive she kept hidden in a box of old photographs he would never think to open. There were nights when the numbers blurred together and she had to stop, press her palms against her eyes, and remind herself that the exhaustion she felt was not weakness, but the natural cost of doing something difficult and necessary. She thought, more than once, of simply signing whatever was placed in front of her, of letting the whole ordeal end quickly so she could stop feeling the particular ache of discovering, page by page, how thoroughly she had been managed rather than loved. But each time that thought surfaced, she remembered the way Sterling had avoided her eyes at the dinner table, the way his voice had gone flat and rehearsed when she asked him a simple question, and the exhaustion hardened back into resolve. She noticed, over those long nights of reading, patterns that had escaped her during the ordinary busyness of married life. A transfer here, unusually large and unexplained. A statement that no longer matched the balance she remembered from months earlier. An investment account that had simply vanished from the paperwork she used to see every quarter, as though it had never existed at all. When she brought these questions to Sterling directly, he answered with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to being believed, insisting that every important asset in their marriage belonged, in one legal sense or another, to him alone, and that she would be wise to accept the settlement rather than spend money she did not have fighting a battle she could not win. Amara did not argue. She thanked him for his honesty, told him she would think it over, and climbed the stairs slowly, aware of the strange calm settling over her, the calm of a woman who has finally stopped waiting for an explanation that will never come, and started building one for herself instead. She sat on the edge of the bed they had shared for over a decade, and looked at the room around her, the curtains she had chosen, the dresser he had insisted on, the small watercolor from their honeymoon that suddenly looked less like a memory and more like evidence of a life she had believed in more than he ever had. She picked up her phone and searched through old contacts until she found a name a friend from her old law firm days had given her weeks before, almost as a joke, almost as an insurance policy she had hoped never to need. Dorian Mercer had built a career on cases exactly like this one, marriages that ended not with shouting but with careful, cold engineering, one spouse quietly rearranging the architecture of shared wealth, while the other still believed they were building a life together. He was not a man who made promises he could not keep, and in their first meeting he told Amara plainly that he could not guarantee she would win, that family court could be unpredictable, that judges saw 1,000 faces like Sterling's every year and did not always see through them in time. But he told her something else too, something that stayed with her long after she left his office. He said that money, was rarely the real prize in cases like this. The real prize was the truth of when things had actually begun. Because a man who starts planning his exit while still pretending to be present has already broken something the law takes very seriously. And if she could prove exactly when Sterling had begun preparing to leave her, the entire settlement he was trying to force on her could unravel. Amara left that meeting with a strange, steady sense of purpose. The first clean feeling she had experienced in weeks that was not grief. Dorian's office had been unremarkable in every visible way. A modest room lined with case files and a single window overlooking a parking structure, but something about the plainness of it had steadied her, as though the absence of theater meant she was finally in the presence of someone who dealt only in facts. He had asked her, near the end of their conversation, what she wanted from all of this beyond fairness, and she had surprised herself by answering honestly. She did not want revenge. She wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside her own memory, recorded, undeniable, so that no one, including Sterling, could ever again tell her that she was imagining things or exaggerating what had happened. She began combing back through the last year of her marriage with new eyes, searching for the small, strange details she had once dismissed as nothing. There had been business trips that grew longer than they used to be, weekends away that produced no photographs, no stories told at dinner afterward, nothing but a tired man returning home with his phone, always angled just slightly out of her view. There had been calls he took in the garage with the door closed, calls he described afterward as work matters too dull to repeat. There had been charges on a card she rarely checked, dinners for two, at restaurants he never once mentioned, taking her to, charges she had once let slide, because she trusted him, and because trust, once given freely for over a decade, does not simply vanish the moment it should. She wrote it all down for Dorian, dates as best she could remember them, and he cross-referenced her memory against the financial records they had gathered, building a timeline that grew clearer and more damning with every page. It was Dorian who found the transaction that changed everything. A large transfer moved out of one of their joint accounts only days before Sterling had finally slid that folder across the dinner table, a transfer made while he was still, by every outward appearance, a husband planning a quiet Christmas with his wife. The money had not simply moved once. It had moved several times, threading through accounts that seemed designed less to hide wealth than to make it difficult to follow, each transfer creating just enough distance between Sterling and the funds that a casual observer might lose the thread entirely. Amara began to understand, watching Dorian trace the path with the patience of a man who had clearly done this before, that Sterling was not merely trying to end their marriage on favorable terms. He was trying to make certain that whatever remained afterward would be structured so completely around him that Amara would have nothing solid left to claim, no clear line she could point to and say, "This belongs to both of us." She felt something harden in her chest as the picture came together. Not rage exactly, but a kind of clarity. The sensation of finally seeing a room she had lived in for years, under a light bright enough to reveal every crack in the walls. What hurt most was not the money. It was the quiet, patient dishonesty behind it. The understanding that while she had spent the last year of her marriage trying to be a good wife, Sterling had spent that same year treating her as an obstacle to be managed. An old acquaintance from Amara's early career, a woman named Vivian Ashford, who had once worked alongside Sterling at a firm downtown, reached out to her almost by accident, mentioning in passing that she had seen Sterling in the lobby of a well-known family law office months earlier, long before Christmas Eve, long before any hint of trouble had reached the outside world. Vivian had thought nothing of it at the time, had assumed perhaps he was there for a colleague or a case unrelated to himself. But when she heard through the grapevine that Sterling and Amara were separating, the memory returned to her with new weight, and she felt Amara deserved to know. That single sighting confirmed what the financial records had already suggested. Sterling had begun preparing to leave his marriage many months before he ever gave Amara the smallest sign that anything was wrong, and every gentle word he had spoken to her during that time, every ordinary evening they had shared, had unfolded beneath a plan he was quietly building behind her back. Amara sat with that knowledge for a long while, before she let herself feel its full weight. It was not simply that her husband no longer loved her. It was that he had continued performing love with total precision, long after he had already decided to leave, and she wondered, with a kind of quiet horror, how many of the memories she cherished from that final year had been real to him at all. Dorian's search eventually led them to a document connected to the largest asset in the marriage, a property investment the couple had made years earlier that had grown substantially in value, one that both of them had signed at the time with equal ownership. Buried within the newer paperwork Sterling's attorney had submitted was a supplemental document bearing Amara's signature, dated only a few months earlier, transferring her interest in that property into an arrangement that would leave Sterling with near total control. Amara stared at the signature for a long time, tilting the page under the light, tracing the shape of the letters with her eyes. It looked like her handwriting. It moved the way her handwriting moved, the same slight lean, the same habit of curling the final letter of her own name. But she had never signed any such document. She had never even seen it before that moment. The realization arrived slowly. Then all at once, the way cold water finds every part of the body eventually. Someone had produced her signature on a document she had no memory of ever encountering, and whatever comfort remained in believing this was simply an ugly divorce began to give way to something far more serious. Dorian did not panic, though Amara could see the shift in his posture the moment he understood what they were looking at. He explained to her, in the calm, measured way he explained everything, that forged signatures were rare but not unheard of, in cases where one spouse controlled the majority of the financial infrastructure of a marriage, and that if this document had truly been fabricated, it changed the nature of everything they were dealing with. This was no longer only a dispute over the fair division of property. It was potentially fraud, committed against her, using her own name, likely by someone who had access to both her signature and the legal apparatus needed to make the fabrication convincing. He arranged for a forensic document examiner to review the signature alongside verified samples of Amara's actual handwriting, warning her that the process would take time and that she needed to prepare herself for whatever the results might reveal, including results that could implicate people closer to her than she wanted to imagine. The days leading up to the court date stretched long and strange, filled with a tension Amara had never experienced before, not even during the darkest arguments of her marriage. Sterling remained outwardly composed, occasionally almost warm, as though some part of him still believed that charm could undo what the paperwork had already done. He suggested once, over a stilted phone call, that she consider simply signing the original settlement and letting the whole matter end quietly, framing it as a kindness to both of them, a way to avoid dragging their private business into a courtroom where strangers would pick apart the wreckage of their marriage. Amara listened, without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked him a single question, her voice even, almost gentle. She asked how long he had been planning this before he ever said a word to her. The silence that followed stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. Sterling did not deny it. He did not confirm it either. He simply looked away, the same way he had looked away at the dinner table weeks earlier. And in that silence, Amara understood with total certainty that their marriage had not ended in one conversation. It had been ending for a long time, quietly, deliberately, while she still believed they were building something together. Not long after that call, Dorian received copies of an earlier legal filing Sterling had made months before, connected to a separate business matter, in which he had described the ownership structure of several shared assets in terms that directly contradicted the story he was now telling in the divorce proceedings. In that earlier filing, made under oath, Sterling had listed Amara as an equal owner of the very property he was now trying to claim entirely for himself. Dorian read the contradiction twice before he called Amara to tell her, and even through the phone she could hear something in his voice she had not heard before, a kind of careful excitement, the tone of a man who has finally found the thread that will unravel the whole garment. He told her this discrepancy alone would be difficult for Sterling to explain away in front of a judge, and that, combined with the timeline they had built and the questionable signatures still under forensic review, they finally had enough to walk into that courtroom with real strength behind them. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray, the kind of winter light that makes everything look slightly unreal. The courthouse stood at the edge of downtown, its wide stone steps dusted faintly with frost, and inside, the air carried the particular chill of a building designed for formality rather than comfort. Sterling arrived early, dressed in the same confident manner he wore to every important meeting of his life, his posture relaxed, his expression composed in the way of a man who has already decided how the day will end. He believed, as he had believed from the very beginning, that Amara would falter under the pressure of a formal proceeding, that whatever quiet strength she had shown at the dinner table weeks earlier would collapse once she stood in a room built to intimidate. He avoided her eyes as she walked in beside Dorian, choosing instead to study the polished surface of the defense table, as though looking at her might somehow weaken the resolve he had spent so long constructing. The bailiff called the room to order, and the small sounds of shifting chairs and closing folders settled into a silence that felt heavier than any Amara had experienced before. Judge Naomi Caldwell entered the courtroom with the unhurried authority of someone who had presided over 1,000 cases exactly like this one, marriages ending not in violence, but in the quieter cruelty of financial maneuvering. She took her seat without hurry, arranged the papers before her with the precision of someone who had long ago learned that careless preparation was how the guilty slipped through, and looked out over the room with an expression that gave away nothing at all. She was not swayed by confidence or charm, having long ago learned that both were frequently worn by people with the most to hide. Sterling's attorney opened by describing the marriage as one that had simply run its course, framing the settlement as reasonable and the major assets as rightfully belonging to his client through years of individual effort. Amara sat quietly beside Dorian, her hands folded in her lap exactly as they had been on that first terrible night, offering no visible reaction, as the story of her own marriage was narrated by strangers in a language that stripped it of everything that had once made it feel real. Dorian, when his turn came, did not raise his voice or make grand gestures. He simply began asking questions, methodical and precise, each one narrowing the distance between the story Sterling's side was telling and the story the documents actually supported. Sterling answered the early questions with practiced ease, confident that the broad strokes of his narrative would hold. He described the property in question as an asset he alone had built and managed, dismissing Amara's contributions with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being taken at his word. But as Dorian introduced the earlier filing, the one in which Sterling himself had listed Amara as an equal owner, a small crack appeared in his composure, visible only to those paying close attention. He offered an explanation about outdated paperwork, about administrative oversights, but the explanation grew thinner with each question that followed, and Judge Caldwell, listening with the stillness of someone building her own private timeline, began to lean forward slightly in her seat, the way a person leans when a story they are being told no longer matches the story the evidence is quietly telling instead. It was the matter of the disputed transfer that finally brought the tension in the room to a point of no return. Dorian presented the record of the transaction moved out of the joint account only days before Sterling had filed for divorce, a transfer he had never disclosed anywhere in his original financial statement. Sterling attempted to explain it as a routine business matter unrelated to the marriage, his words coming faster now, less certain, the confidence of the morning beginning to fray at the edges. Judge Caldwell studied the papers in front of her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before she looked up and asked him directly why an account he claimed to know nothing about carried his own signature on the very document that had opened it. The question was simple. The silence that followed it was not. Sterling opened his mouth to answer and found, for the first time in the entire proceeding, that no smooth explanation arrived. He glanced toward his attorney, expecting rescue, but his attorney was flipping through papers with the same searching, uncertain expression, unable to offer the answer his client so clearly needed. The courtroom, usually filled with the small, ambient sounds of shifting papers and quiet murmurs, fell into a silence so complete that Amara could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Judge Caldwell did not repeat the question. She simply waited, the way a teacher waits for a student who has clearly not done the reading, allowing the silence itself to do the work that words could not. Somewhere behind Amara, a chair creaked faintly as someone shifted their weight, and the small sound seemed enormous in a room that had otherwise gone completely still. Amara did not look at Sterling. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge, on the steady, patient way she waited, and understood in that moment that she had spent years of her marriage waiting for a version of this stillness from Sterling himself, a moment where he would simply stop performing long enough to tell her the truth, and he had never once given it to her freely. It had taken a stranger in a black robe, armed with nothing but a single sharp question, to finally pull it out of him. Finally, Sterling spoke, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier polish, and he admitted that he had, in fact, opened that account himself, though he insisted it had nothing to do with hiding assets from his wife. The admission, small as it seemed on its surface, cracked open something larger. Once he had conceded that single fact, the rest of his careful narrative began to unravel in pieces, each new question from Dorian pulling loose another thread. It became clear, through the documents and through Sterling's own halting testimony, that he had used shared marital funds to establish accounts and investments Amara had never known existed, structuring them in ways designed to make them appear separate from the marriage entirely. It became clear, too, that the story he had told at the dinner table, the story of a decision made quickly and cleanly at the end of a marriage that had simply run its course, was not true. He had begun building his exit long before he ever gave Amara reason to suspect anything was wrong, and he had done so specifically to ensure that when the end finally came, she would be left with as little leverage as possible. The judge asked several more pointed questions in the minutes that followed, each one narrower and more specific than the last, and Sterling's answers grew shorter, less confident, punctuated by long pauses, in which he seemed to be searching for a version of events that might still hold together. His attorney tried once to redirect the conversation toward the broader fairness of the proposed settlement, but Judge Caldwell cut through the attempt with a single observation, noting that fairness could not be evaluated honestly until the court understood exactly what had been hidden and why. The room seemed to lean forward collectively at that remark, and even the court reporters typing slowed, as though the machine itself sensed the weight of what was unfolding. Sterling's composure did not collapse all at once. It eroded slowly, the way a riverbank gives way, not in a single dramatic moment, but through 1,000 small losses that finally add up to something visible. He tried briefly to reframe his actions as the natural response to a marriage that had made him feel controlled, unseen, trapped by expectations he had never fully agreed to. Amara listened to this explanation without flinching, and when Dorian gestured for her to respond, she spoke for the first time that day, her voice steady, carrying easily across the quiet room. She said that Sterling had every right to leave a marriage that no longer made him happy, that no one could be forced to stay in a life they no longer wanted. But she said, too, that leaving did not give him the right to rewrite the truth of their shared history in order to take more than what was rightfully his, and that a man who spends months quietly preparing to strip his wife of everything she helped build is not simply ending a marriage. He is committing a kind of theft, dressed up in the language of moving on. The final piece of evidence Dorian introduced concerned the ownership of the couple's largest shared asset, the very property at the center of the disputed, possibly forged, signature. Judge Caldwell reviewed the full chain of documents slowly, methodically, comparing dates, comparing signatures, comparing the story Sterling had told at the beginning of the hearing against the story the paperwork now openly contradicted. Sterling watched her read with the expression of a man watching his own carefully built structure come apart in real time, unable to stop it, unable even to look away. In a moment of visible desperation, he turned toward Amara and suggested, quietly, that perhaps the two of them could resolve the matter privately, outside the formal proceedings, in a way that would spare them both further embarrassment. Amara declined without hesitation. She was not interested in punishing him further than the truth already had. She was simply no longer willing to place her future in the hands of a man who had already proven, in the clearest possible terms, that his promises meant nothing once he believed no one was watching. Judge Caldwell reminded the room, in a tone that carried the weight of long experience, that a courtroom does not exist to soothe wounded feelings or reward charm. It exists to weigh evidence and assign responsibility according to what actually happened, regardless of how either party might wish to be remembered. Sterling was left to face the consequences of a plan he had constructed with such care, a plan built on the assumption that Amara would never look closely enough to see it. And that assumption, more than any single document, was the thing that had truly failed him. When the judge finally spoke again, her voice was calm but final. She stated plainly that she would not approve the settlement as originally proposed, that the evidence presented raised serious concerns about the accuracy and good faith of Sterling's financial disclosures, and that the matter would require a far more thorough accounting before any final division of assets could be considered fair. Outside the courtroom, in the wide marble hallway where winter light fell in pale rectangles across the floor, Sterling approached Amara one final time. The arrogance that had carried him through the morning was gone entirely now, replaced by something smaller, more uncertain, a man suddenly aware of how completely he had misjudged the woman he had spent over a decade calling his wife. He told her, quietly, that things could still be fixed between them, that he had underestimated her, that he understood now what he had lost. Amara studied his face for a long moment, searching for some trace of the man she had once loved, and found only the same practiced sincerity he had always used when he needed something from her. She told him, without cruelty, that she believed he was finally seeing her clearly for the first time in years, but that seeing something clearly after you have already destroyed it does not undo the damage. She did not raise her voice. She simply turned and walked toward the doors, Dorian beside her, leaving Sterling standing alone beneath the pale winter light, with nothing left to offer that she still wanted. In the weeks that followed, Amara began the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding her life on her own terms. She moved out of the house that had once held so much promise, carrying with her only the things that felt truly hers, the photographs from before the marriage, the small collection of books she had read during the loneliest nights of that final year, the grandmother's china she had set with such hope on Christmas Eve. She left behind the furniture Sterling had chosen, the artwork that had never quite matched her taste, everything that had belonged more to the life he wanted than to the life she had actually lived. Each box she packed felt less like loss and more like sorting, separating what had truly been hers from what had only ever been borrowed under his name. Friends who had watched the marriage from a careful distance told her they admired her composure through it all, and Amara found herself surprised by how true that composure felt, not as a performance, but as something she had earned through the slow, exhausting work of choosing clarity over collapse. Vivian Ashford, the old acquaintance whose passing remark had first confirmed how long Sterling had been planning his departure, became an unexpected steady presence during those weeks, checking in with short messages that asked for nothing in return, reminding Amara gently that rebuilding did not have to happen quickly to happen well. Amara found comfort in these small kindnesses, the ordinary decency of people who simply showed up without needing to be asked twice, a decency that stood in sharp contrast to the elaborate, secretive planning Sterling had poured into ending their marriage instead of simply being honest about it from the start. She understood now that the hardest part of the entire ordeal had never really been the courtroom, or the documents, or even the forged signature that had first cracked open the full extent of Sterling's deception. The hardest part had been accepting that a person could share a bed, a home, a decade of ordinary mornings with someone, and still be capable of planning their departure in complete secrecy, treating every shared memory as background noise to a decision already made. She grieved that realization quietly, in small private moments, allowing herself to feel the loss without letting it define the shape of what came next. What frightened her most, she came to realize, was not the divorce itself. It was the years she might have spent afterward wondering what she had done wrong. Had she never found that first strange date on that first strange document? Had she simply signed what she was told to sign and disappeared quietly into whatever life Sterling had already planned for her without her consent? Several weeks after the hearing, a letter arrived from the court, formal in tone, informing Amara that one final procedural matter remained before the case could be considered fully resolved, a hearing to confirm the accounting of assets Judge Caldwell had ordered. Amara read the letter twice, feeling none of the dread such a notice might once have inspired. She understood now that this final step was not a threat, but a formality, one more piece of a process that had already tilted decisively toward the truth. She placed the letter in a drawer beside the other documents from the case, no longer relics of fear, but proof of everything she had survived, and returned to the quiet, ordinary business of her evening. Time moved forward the way it always does, indifferent to grief, indifferent to triumph, simply carrying everyone along regardless of what they were ready for. Amara completed the final proceedings without drama, the accounting confirming what the earlier hearing had already made clear, and the marriage that had once defined so much of her identity finally closed, not with a dramatic gesture, but with the quiet finality of paperwork properly filed. She built her days around new routines, small and steady. Morning walks through a neighborhood she had chosen entirely for herself. Evenings spent with friends who had stood beside her through the worst of it, a career she had once let dim in favor of a marriage that no longer deserved the sacrifice. She returned to work with a renewed focus that surprised even her colleagues, taking on projects she had once turned down for lack of time, rediscovering a version of herself that had existed long before Sterling and had simply been waiting, patiently, for room to breathe again. Some evenings she still caught herself glancing toward the door out of old habit, half expecting to hear his key in the lock, and in those moments she allowed herself a brief, quiet grief before returning to whatever book or conversation had filled the silence he once occupied. Healing, she was learning, did not arrive as a single triumphant moment, but as 1,000 small returns to herself, repeated patiently until they became the shape of an ordinary day. There was no dramatic new companion waiting to complete the story, no sudden rescue from loneliness, and Amara found she did not need one. The story had never truly been about replacing what she lost. It had always been about recovering what she had nearly given away. On the next Christmas Eve, she stood alone at the window of her new apartment, watching the city stretch out below in a scatter of golden lights, the same kind of glow that had once filled the dining room, where her marriage had quietly ended a year before. She did not wait for a call that would not come. She did not flinch at the sound of footsteps on the stairs outside, no longer bracing herself for confrontation, no longer running through the endless list of things she might have done differently to deserve a different outcome. She thought, instead, of the moment in that cold courtroom when a single question, asked in a calm and steady voice, had unraveled a year of carefully constructed lies. She thought of how much power there had been in that silence, the silence Sterling could not fill, the silence that had told her everything his words had spent months trying to hide. She understood now, standing in the quiet of her own chosen home, that not every ending is a tragedy. Some marriages end not to destroy the person left holding the pieces, but to finally set them free from a life that had already stopped serving them long before anyone admitted it aloud. Amara did not think of herself as a woman who had lost a husband. She thought of herself as a woman who had, through patience and clarity and the courage to keep asking questions no one wanted to answer, finally found her way back to herself. The lights of the city flickered steadily beyond the glass, and for the first time, in longer than she could remember, Christmas Eve did not feel like something to survive. It felt, simply and completely, like the beginning of a life that finally belonged entirely to her.